And does the FBI director currently report to anyone?
Well, you mean in a chain of command,
Yes.
reporting structure kind of
Yes.
thing? Yeah, so the FBI is part of the Justice Department. On the org chart, you would see that the FBI director, and this has been true for decades, reports to the Deputy Attorney General, who reports to the Attorney General. Obviously, reports in a communication sense, I report to any number of people.
As opposed to a micromanagement reporting system.
Correct.
And you would take issue, would you not, with any proposal that would change or alter that chain of command and place you or place a FBI director in the position of reporting directly to the president? Would you not? You would oppose that?
I don't think that would be a wise reporting structure. I think the structure that we've had for decades now makes sense. I think there's a difference between independence in a sort of organizational structure perspective and independence in terms of the way you do the work. Obviously, the FBI is part of the Justice Department.
Well, reporting directly to the president would eliminate your independence, would it not?
I don't think it would help.
Yeah. And you're familiar with Project 2025, are you not?
I mean, I've seen news reports about it. I'm not particularly familiar with it.
You're aware that it is a game plan for President Trump's first 120 days in office, correct?
I'm really not familiar with the details. Again, I've seen reporting about it.
It is, and what he proposes to do is to force the FBI director to appoint, report directly to him. That's what he wants to do within the first 120 days. He also wants to eliminate the position of FBI General Counsel. That is also set forth in Project 2025. How would you recommend that?
I think the FBI's Office of General Counsel serves an incredibly important role, including in terms of advising our workforce. We have 38,000 people. The idea of having an organization like ours, an independent law enforcement agency like ours that doesn't have its own general counsel's office doesn't make sense to me.
Well, it would seem like any proposal that would force the director to report to the president, and then there would be no legal counsel for the director of the FBI. That seems like it's an attempt to neuter the FBI and render it accountable only to the president. Isn't that correct?
Well, let me put it this way. I recognize that the FBI director, this FBI director and every FBI director before me, serves at the pleasure of the president. And that's part of our system. I was appointed by President Trump. I respect that. I think that's a part of our structure. But independence in terms of how we do our work is what matters to me. And we need to be able to do our work in a way that is free from political interference.
Well, you wouldn't be able to do that by reporting everything you do to the president and getting his authority and approval before you take action, correct?
I don't think that would be a wise approach.
And then there's even a proposal to replace many of those 38,000 dedicated civil servants who work for the FBI, replace them with a MAGA group that has pledged its allegiance to Donald Trump. What danger would that bring to the FBI if that were to happen?
Well, again, I haven't read or reviewed this thing that you're referring to.
Assuming what I say is true.
But the FBI is made up of 38,000 dedicated career law enforcement professionals. It has no political appointees of any kind, unless you count me, any of the former presidents. I don't think that should change. I think that is part of how we do our work.
Being the employees of the FBI.
We're coming up on 116 years of the FBI, and that's the way it has been for 116 years.
It would be crazy to take 38,000 MAGA loyalists and put them at the FBI. That's frightening. That's what Project 2025 proposes, and I'm glad to know that you are not with that program, and with that I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Was the shooter on the FBI's radar in any way prior to the assassination attempt?
We did not have any information about the shooter. He was not in our holdings before the shooting.
No communication in any chat rooms, no CIs or confidential human sources have any interaction with
No, we've run a thorough search for the subject through all of our holdings, and he was not in them anywhere.
Were there any FBI agents or informants present at the Trump rally in Butler?
Not to my knowledge.
And Mr. Jordan was talking to you about Iran. Were law enforcement resources diverted from the protection of President Trump to John Bolton as a consequence of concern that Mr. Bolton might have been the target of Iranian malign efforts?
That's really a Secret Service decision. I don't know the answer to that. That's really something they would know better. What I can tell you is that there are a number of individuals. You mentioned one who we've brought a case, a specific criminal case for the Iranians targeting for assassination. But how the
Are you going to get that answer to us? Whether or not resources were diverted from Trump to Bolton? Is that just going to be part of your review?
I think that's going to be part of the reviews by the Inspector General.
The Inspector General for DHS, right?
Of DHS,
right.
and the outside panel.
And I think that's an important point, because the Inspector General for DHS has really fallen out of favor with the administration, because he's been pointing out all the problems on the border with Mayorkas and Biden, and we're always kind of worried that they're about to fire him, which would be a really bad idea now that this role that you've identified is so critical. Be a bad idea to fire the IG for DHS during the pendency of this, right, Mr. Director?
I don't think that would be a good idea.
I'm with you on that. So I want to zoom out a little bit. How often do you brief President Biden?
You mean on this specific case?
No, in your role as FBI director.
I mean, I don't know that I could give you a number.
Is it like weekly, monthly, daily?
It's not at a regular cadence. There have been times when there have been months at a time when I haven't, and then there have been times when several days apart I have.
The Vice President, is she typically there?
Often has been.
Okay, so when did you notice his decline?
In my interactions, in my role, all my interactions with the current president have been completely professional.
Right, but I mean the cognitive decline. I'm not saying he treated you unprofessionally, just maybe not picking things up as quickly as he used to.
Again, I don't meet with him very often, but what you're describing is not something that I've observed during my interactions with him.
I mean, we've had it observed so often that the ranking member and Mr. Schiff on this committee have said that he could no longer continue as a candidate. And so, since you're the FBI director, I was just sort of wondering, like, who's running the country? Like if something bad happened, you'd have to go brief President Biden about it right now? God forbid?
And on any number of occasions, I have briefed the president, and as I say, things have all been uneventful and unremarkable.
Oh, I can imagine them being uneventful. But in the work where the vice president's also present, like you say, there's like more than half the time there's these briefings, she's there too?
I don't know if I'd said more than half the time. Certainly, there have been times where she's been present. There have been other times where she hasn't.
I take you at your word when you say this is the most complicated threat environment you've ever observed over a long career in law enforcement. And I'm just kind of wondering, with this assassination attempt, with the invasion at our border, with all the Hamas that have been let in that you've talked about and briefed about, like, is Biden up to it? And if he's not up to it, and you're a guy who's been regularly briefing him, like, who's been in on this conspiracy to hide the real Joe Biden from all of us for years? It never occurred to you that this guy wasn't up to it in all these briefings you did?
As I said, my briefings with the president have all been completely fine.
Were they between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m.?
He's asked questions. There hasn't been anything of note in the area that you're talking about.
Yeah, did you ever have to brief him before 10 a.m. or after 4 p.m.? We hear those are as good hours.
Certainly times that I have briefed have included outside those hours.
Right, okay. I just, you know, I think the American people want to know how we got to this point with someone who's so diminished his own party has basically put him out to pasture. And since you had close proximity and the vice president had close proximity, I'm just kind of wondering if you were being straight with all of us about how things were going with him. I guess we'll have to figure that out.
You can count on me to be straight with you, sir.
We'll see.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized.
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to recognize, unfortunately, the fact that our colleague and my colleagues side by side made for many, many years in this committee, Sheila Jackson-Lee is no longer with us. She was a great member and a force for America, and her loss is felt and is great. Secondly, I'd like to say to the FBI director that there were some remarks made when you were introduced, preemptory remarks saying that people don't have great faith in the FBI and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have great faith in the FBI, and I think most of us on this side of the aisle do. And we appreciate your work and appreciate your being here. Some on the other side of the aisle have cast aspersions upon the FBI and upon law enforcement. And if they don't want to support law enforcement, that's their business. But I support law enforcement, and the FBI is the top rank of law enforcement in our country. So I thank you and all of your people that work with you. Secondly, there's been some questions about the FBI maybe being weaponized. Did President Biden ever ask you to get involved in the case in Orlando, Florida, where Kevin McCarthy says that Mr. Gates is investigated for some sexual involvement with a 17-year-old girl? Did the president or anybody in the Democratic Party, as Mr. McCarthy has suggested, weaponized you and tried to get you involved in that case?
No, sir.
Good. Thank you. Just wanted to make sure of that. Butler, Pennsylvania, I read something about a ladder. He used a ladder to get up on that roof, and that the ladder was found somewhere a distance away. Is that true?
So we do know that he purchased a ladder. I think, if I recall correctly, it was about a 5-foot tall type of ladder. But importantly, we did not find the ladder at the scene. So it's not clear that he used the ladder to get on top of the roof.
So you don't think
we're
the ladder...
still digging into all that, things related to the ladder and his access to the roof. But he did buy a ladder, but the ladder was not found at the scene.
The ladder didn't have any feet on it. It didn't walk off.
Oh, right.
Thank you, sir. There have been a lot of threats against public officials. We've seen Mr. Scalise terribly shot, and we saw Gabby Gifford shot, and other Congress people, and many of us have had death threats. And the FBI has, I think, been made aware of those to help protect us, and I appreciate that greatly. But we've also had election officials and poll workers threatened. What is the FBI doing in consultation with other law enforcement to ensure every eligible voter can safely and confidently cast a ballot this year?
So when it comes to threats to election workers in particular, we participate in the election threats task force that DOJ set up. We also, and there have been quite a number already of arrests and convictions under that task force. We have got a number of investigations underway that involve all kinds of threats to election workers, ranging from online threats to, there was even some mailings that included fentanyl. So there's been a number of types of threats to election workers. And these are, after all, people who are putting in their own time for the good of the country to try to help us have a functioning democracy. And so the idea that they would be targeted with violence is just outrageous. We are sharing information with election officials about things to be on the lookout for. We have election crime coordinators in all 50 states.
And you'll be prepared for Election Day with additional, FBI will be looking out for.
Yes.
Thank you, thank you. Jeffrey Epstein, been in the news a lot lately about involvement with certain people high in politics involved. Did the FBI conduct the raid on his townhouse in New York when he was incarcerated in New York? There was a raid on his East Side townhouse.
Well, I don't know about a raid. I know we executed a number of searches in the course of our fairly extensive investigation related to Mr. Epstein.
Can you tell me if, during that search, if you came across and have within the possession of the FBI tapes of him with other individuals that he might have taken in, people in compromising positions?
Yeah, I don't know that there's anything I can share related to that. I can see if there's information we could provide and maybe get back to you on it.
If there were tapes of people in prominent positions, friends of his he posed for pictures with, possibly in compromising positions, it would be the public, I think, has a right to see those.
Well, I mean, how we handle evidence recovered in a criminal investigation has all kinds of rules that apply to it. I recognize the intense public interest in the subject, but we'd have to follow our rules. But I'm happy, like I said, I'm happy to follow up with my team on it.
Thank you, sir, and I appreciate your service, and thank you for being here today.
The gentleman yield the last 5. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here. How many shots did the shooter fire?
Well, we know that he fired at least 8 because we recovered 8 cartridges on the roof.
Okay, and are all the cartridges and the unspent bullets, have they been, you know how many there are? You've accounted for all of those? I assume, yeah.
We believe we have. Again, there was lots of work still ongoing, but yes, we believe we have accounted.
And did the recovered shells, the cartridges, match the shooter's rifle?
My recollection is yes.
Okay. And you conducted an analysis that confirms that?
Well, we work with ATF, but yes, so some of the work has been divided up. But.
And how many shells casings were recovered from the location of the counter snipers?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
From the counter snipers location?
That I don't have the answer, at least here at my fingertips.
Okay. Did the blood and tissue pattern of the shooter, did it match the stories or the witness testimony that you've heard so far?
Can you, well, I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Well, I assume you've interviewed the counter snipers, or you have that evidence, and other witnesses describing the kill of the shooter. And I'm wondering if the blood and tissue and brain matter is consistent with the testimony that you're receiving. In other words, is the physical...
In terms of the manner of death?
Exactly. Is the physical evidence consistent with where the shot from the counter sniper took place?
Yeah. So the autopsy is being handled by, as is not unusual, the state authorities. My understanding is thus far, I don't think it's fully complete, which is not, again, not totally unusual. But so far, nothing remarkable on that front.
That's from the body itself, but from actually the scene where the shooter was found, is everything consistent with the testimony, the physical evidence at the scene? Is that consistent with the testimony you've seen, that you've heard so far?
So far, yes. Again, ongoing investigation.
Were you able to determine whether the shooter took the gun up with him when he climbed up to the top of the roof, or was it already placed there somewhere?
So that is something that we're drilling into right now that we don't know the answer to yet. I can tell you, which may be relevant, though, to your question, that, and I don't think this has been reported yet, that the weapon had a collapsible stock, which could explain why it might have been less easy for people to observe. You know, because one of the things that we're finding is people have observed him, the first people to observe him with the weapon were when he was already on the roof, and we haven't yet found anybody with firsthand observation of him with the weapon walking around beforehand. So that doesn't mean he wasn't, obviously, but the collapsible stock is potentially a very significant feature that might be relevant to that.
Did he have a scope?
I believe so, but as I sit here right now, I don't remember.
Okay. You mentioned about 2 hours before the incident that he'd had a drone and he was using a drone. Instead of me putting words in your mouth, just tell me how you discovered the drone, how you discovered the time, and how you discovered, if you can describe what he would have been observing with the drone and how you determined that, please.
So this is something that's very much ongoing right now. We're going back and forth with our lab as they continue to do work on it. What I would say is the drone was in his car. As I said, we've been able to, by exploiting the drone, determine, its use and flight paths. There were no pictures or videos on the drone of the day of the rally, for example, but we have been able to reverse engineer the flight path of the drone from the day of the rally, and that's how we know that for about 11 minutes from I think it's around 3:50 p.m. to 4 p.m., somewhere in that range. He was flying the drone, and we have the flight path. It's about 200 yards away from where former President Trump would ultimately be speaking. And so that would have primarily given him a vantage point. I'm trying to think how to describe this. If the former president's podium is that way,
Yeah.
the drone would be over here looking, say 200 yards again off this way, looking back. So it would have shown the shooter, we think, again, we're still doing more work on this. I really want to qualify what I'm saying, but I'm trying to be transparent and lean in here. We think it would have shown him kind of what would have been behind him.
But when you say behind him, behind the shooter.
Correct. Like, in other words, almost like giving him a rear view mirror of the scene behind him, except again, he wasn't flying it overhead while he was later back for the assassination.
But he would have had, with the drone, he would have been able to also assess kind of what, because the stage, I assume, was already set, he would have been able to assess that angle with the rooftop as well, forward and backward, I assume.
Well, certainly going towards the podium. Again, we're still trying to figure out exactly what he saw, because we're having to, in effect, because there's no recording of what he saw during those 11 minutes, our hypothesis at this point, the experts think he would have been live streaming it. And so we're trying to, in effect, say, okay, well, if this was the flight pattern, given these capabilities of the drone, what would you have seen? What could you have seen for those 11 minutes? And again, it wasn't over the stage or the kind of the hub of the rally. It was about 200 yards away, but it looks like it would have been looking, let's say, length of a football field or so, more, kind of towards the podium.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
How many separate times was the shooter on the premises?
So again, with the caveat that we're continuing to do work on it, we believe that the first time he traveled to the grounds was, I think, a week before, and he spent roughly 20 minutes there. Then he went to the grounds again on the morning of the event, it appears, for about 70 minutes, I think. But again, I qualify that. I'd have to go back and look to be sure of that part. And then he came back in the afternoon, so that would be, I guess, a third time for good. But that included things like this drone activity we just talked about.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, thank you for appearing. Thank you for the extraordinary job that you're doing. Please convey our thanks to the men and women at the Bureau for their incredible work. I've worked with them since I was an assistant U.S. attorney more than 30 years ago. Let me start with a threshold question I'm curious about. When I applied to be an assistant U.S. attorney, I had to go through a background check. Do candidates for the FBI have to go through background checks?
Yes.
Would someone with dozens of felony convictions survive a background check for the Bureau?
No.
So they would never be hired by the Bureau?
No.
Well, clearly the Bureau has, you don't have to comment on this, I know you won't, but clearly the Bureau has higher standards for their hiring than one of America's great political parties. Let me turn to the events of the tragic shooting. Have you been able to gain access to the shooter's electronic communications, social media, and with the caveats that the investigation is still early, have you been able to make any deductions, or are there any indications of the shooter's motivation from those electronic holdings?
So in terms of our ability to access it, we have been able to get into and exploit a number of electronic devices, digital devices, but not all of them yet. And then within his various accounts, we've been able to get access to some of them, but some of them we're still waiting on. Some of them we may never get access to because of the encryption issue, that it presents an increasingly vexing barrier for law enforcement, not just the FBI, but for law enforcement all over the country. But we're still drilling into that. We have some information. Some places we've been able to look. Some places we will be able to look. Some places we will be able to see, no matter how good our legal process is. But that's what we're looking at right now. In terms of what we've been able to find so far, a lot of the usual repositories of information have not yielded anything notable in terms of motive or like ideology. Having said that, it does appear fairly clear that he was interested in public figures, kind of more broadly, and I think this is important, that starting somewhere around July 6th or so, he became very focused on former President Trump and this rally. And so one of the things that I can share here today that has not been shared yet is that we've just in the last couple of days found that from our review, to your point about devices, analysis of a laptop that the investigation ties to the shooter reveals that on July 6th, he did a Google search for, quote, how far away was Oswald from Kennedy? And so that's a search that obviously is significant in terms of his state of mind. That is the same day that it appears that he registered for the Butler rally.
And when you say that his electronic holdings indicated an interest in different public figures, without revealing anything you're not comfortable revealing about those public figures, can you tell us anything generally about them, either the offices they hold, their political party, or was it simply people of a high profile?
Well, a couple things. First, the images that we've recovered so far from, I can't remember which of his various devices, appear to be what we call cached images from searches of news articles. So if you do a news article search, of course, if there are photos on it, those photos get stored automatically in your cache, as opposed to me searching or him searching for a specific person and getting up images of that person. As far as the pictures that are like that, there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason to it so far, other than these are all prominent public people, but they cover both parties, they cover both U.S. people and even some foreign public officials. So that part doesn't appear to, that one repository of information doesn't appear to be overly indicative of other than interest in public figures, but that could be just because he was reading news stories. So we're still trying to drill into that. That's why all of these outstanding legal process returns that we're waiting on for various accounts, platforms, et cetera, any one of them could be one that would have very indicative, very important information.
If I could be permitted one very short additional question, Chairman. From that, any indication of any other particular target, that is someone who was not just sort of generically the subject of the searches you described, but for which there was more of an interest than others?
There's the information I just described at the moment does not appear particularly indicative of targeting in its own right. But again, that dot, once we get other information, could connect in a way that might be more meaningful. But I'm sharing that piece of information with this committee and with the American public, but I think it's important that we put down a qualification. This does not appear to be some kind of target list or something like that. This is cached images from running searches of news stories. And again, there's nothing at the moment, there's no pattern from that particular piece of information that is overly remarkable so far.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Director, you previously told us that you consider the situation on the southern border to be a massive security threat to our country. Is that still your assessment?
I stand by my prior testimony, and in fact, just in the last month or so, we've done, conducted a significant series of arrests. I say we, our Joint Terrorism Task Force is working with ICE of a number of individuals with suspected international terrorism ties. And I have also been very vocal about the fact that and this is really since the last time I appeared before you, that we are increasingly concerned about the possibility not just of a foreign terrorist-inspired attack, which is very much a concern, but even the potential for a coordinated foreign terrorist attack, perhaps like what we've seen against the concert hall in Russia, for example, but just here in the United States.
Well, the 19 suicide bombers who overstayed visas were responsible for 3,000 American deaths on 9/11. What's your best estimate of the number of foreign terrorists who are now in our country?
I don't know that I could give you that number. What I can tell you is we have lots of foreign terrorism-related investigations, but that doesn't mean that all of them came in, illegally or anything like that.
It seems to me that the simplest act of terrorism would be for dozens of guerrillas to attack low-security, high-density venues, for example, Friday night high school football games all across the country at the same hour with bombs and automatic weapons. That would produce thousands of casualties from coast to coast in a matter of minutes. How likely is such a scenario?
Well, what you're describing would require, of course, a lot of coordination. But what I will tell you, and I think you're onto a particularly important point from my perspective, which is that unlike the 9/11 attacks, which, again, I was in FBI headquarters on the day of 9/11, and so I remember it vividly, and I've spent plenty of time in the period after that in my prior positions engaged with the families and the victims. But what we're seeing more and more with the foreign terrorist threat, and frankly also the domestic terrorism threat, is a focus on kind of like what you're talking about, well, what I would call soft targets, which is really for the American people's benefit, just intelligence community speak for where everyday people live their everyday lives.
What terrorist groups have now infiltrated our country that you're tracking?
Well, I don't know that I would say infiltrated. We have investigations as we speak that relate to ISIS and its affiliates. We have investigations as we speak that relate to Al-Qaeda. We have investigations as we speak that relate to Al-Shabaab. We have investigations as we speak that relate to the Iranian proxies, Hezbollah, and so frankly, even the IRGC Quds Force itself.
What foreign criminal gangs are now in our country that you're most concerned with?
Well, foreign criminal gangs, we obviously have investigations, a lot of investigations into, gangs like MS-13, for example, and some of its counterparts. Although I think if you were to talk to most chiefs and sheriffs like I'm doing every week, we shouldn't underestimate how prevalent neighborhood gangs are, really. It's a lot of the gang violence that...
Well, I'm concerned about those that we've allowed in through the southern border and what threat they are now posing. Do you believe that the vetting performed at the southwest border is adequate to ensure that aliens with terrorist or criminal gang ties are not being released into the United States?
Well, it's not really for me to speak to the vetting. What I would tell you is that...
you have to deal with it once they're released into the United States.
And one of the concerns that I have, which I touched on briefly in my opening, is there's been a lot of focus on the number of suspected terrorists encountered at the border, and that number has increased over the last 5 or 6 years, and that should be of concern. But frankly, to me, the bigger concern is individuals who weren't either weren't on the watch list at the time they came in because there wasn't information known yet that ties them to terrorism, and it's only after they get in that some new piece of information develops somewhere overseas, and now we know. That's a bigger concern.
We've been warned that they basically vet against a blank sheet of paper. If they don't have a record in this country, Border Patrol probably doesn't have any record. They're released into the country, and you find out later of the dangers.
Right, or if they use fake documents and there aren't biometrics to connect them. Sometimes there are people who come in who, because of the nature of the threat information that puts somebody on the watch list, there wasn't, fingerprints from the person at the time, because not every piece of intelligence comes with fingerprints. So then the guy comes in using fake ID,
and of course,
there's no reason to connect them.
And of course, the 2 million gotaways you know absolutely nothing about.
Exactly.
Well, I don't know about absolutely nothing, because we may come across them in other things. One of the key parts of our collective defense here is that we work with 800,000 sworn law enforcement across the country, and we train them on the right questions to ask and things like that so that we can build in additional eyes and ears if they, do a traffic stop or whatever happens to be. We run a greater chance of leveraging all that to pick up people who may have slipped through the cracks.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Director, 100 days until the election, Russia has attacked our democracy in past elections. Are they seeking to do it in this one?
We assess that the Russian government continues to want to influence and in various ways interfere with our democracy, with our electoral process. In fact, just in the last few weeks, we announced a significant disruption of a generative AI-enhanced social media, bot farm, essentially, of the Russians that was designed to be an influence operation, and some of the fictitious profiles of those bots purported to be U.S. persons. So they're still at it. We've seen that in election cycle after election cycle.
Do the Russians have a preferred candidate?
I'm not sure that I could speak to that here, but certainly what I would tell you is it's not just the Russians, and I think that's important for people to know too. There's a lot of attention to the Russians, as there should be, but we also know, you may recall that in 2020, Director Ratcliffe and I announced an effort by the Iranians to try to interfere, and more recently, we've had indictments related to China. 34 Chinese MPS officers creating fictitious personas, posting false information online, full of narratives designed to sow divisiveness, discord, undermine us. And I'm talking about narratives that they were pushing, again, purporting to be Americans, but actually Chinese MPS officers. For example, trashing any suggestion that COVID came from a lab leak, right, or trashing U.S. law enforcement on the occasion of the anniversary of George Floyd's death.
And shifting to the attempted assassination on the former president, I want to make it clear, in America, violence has never been the answer. Not on a certain day in January or a recent day in July. And I just want to go through the shooting just briefly with you. How many armed officers were within the perimeter, just ballpark figure?
Which is the subject of the DHS Inspector General's review and the outside panel, independent panel that's been.
Would you say probably more than 100, though?
I have to believe that number, but I don't have that number at my fingertips. Our focus is on the shooter and his attack.
And the shooter was able to get 8 shots off before he was killed?
That's what it would appear, yes.
Type of weapon used by the shooter was an assault rifle?
Was an AR-style rifle.
So that means one trigger pull, one round, is that right?
Essentially.
Do you like to shoot?
Do I?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you know the difference between an AR and a bolt-action rifle?
I'm not going to try to sit here and engage on sort of firearms expertise, but I've fired a variety of weapons. But
had the shooter used a bolt-action rifle, would that have been one trigger pull, one round?
That's my understanding.
Would there had to have been more, well, on an assault rifle, trigger pull, round, bolt action, non-assault rifle, what's the difference? Is it faster, slower?
He was able to get more rounds off more quickly than he would have with other kinds of weapons.
And that's my point, is that we can add additional resources to protect political candidates, and we should. The people who went to that rally deserved to be protected from gun violence, just like the students at Parkland deserve to be protected from gun violence, just like the babies at Sandy Hook deserve to be protected from gun violence. So we'll devote more resources. We've added a presidential candidate who is also now protected. But if we're being honest with ourselves, we have armed this country to the teeth. And we have allowed the most dangerous people to have access to the most dangerous weapons. I say that as a parent of a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old, the 2 oldest who have done multiple mass shooter drills in their classrooms. I say that as a brother to two police officers who walk a very violent beat. And I say that as an elected official who believes that I deserve to be as safe as I deserve to be when we are at political rallies. And so we really need to step back and think, if we allow these weapons to be in our country, can we truly protect our elected officials, and can we truly protect, most importantly, our children and the next generation? I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. It is good to have Mr. Massey back with us today. Some of us had a chance to go to Kentucky over the last few weeks and visit with Thomas and his family and hear all kinds of wonderful stories about Rhonda. Amazing, amazing lady, gentle spirit, and we're glad to have Mr. Massey back with us. And next 5 minutes belong to you, Congressman.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Wray, how many counter snipers were present at the rally that day, and which of the counter snipers took the shot that took out the would-be assassin?
I don't have the number of counter snipers. I know it was the Secret Service counter sniper who took the shot that eliminated the shooter. We've conducted a number of interviews, including of him.
So was it one of the two that we see in the videos on top of the roof, or was it a different location that was shot?
I'm afraid I don't have that at my fingertips here.
Okay. You mentioned that the would-be assassin bought a 5-foot ladder. You have a credit card evidence of that. But it looks like on the scene there was a larger ladder that he might have used. Do you know which ladder he used to get to the roof? And do you have possession of that 5-foot ladder and the other ladder? And do you know how the taller ladder got to the scene?
So this whole business about the ladder is something we're drilling into more. We do have possession of the 5-foot ladder that he purchased close in time to his attempted assassination. That we've traced the purchase of that ladder from a receipt, a bloodied receipt that he had on him at the time his body was recovered on the roof. We do not yet know for sure how exactly he got up on the roof. We're looking at, various forensic pieces to try to kind of piece that together. So more to come on that.
Do you know where the 5-foot ladder were retrieved? Was it near the roof, or was it still in his vehicle?
Neither. I don't have it in front of me, but I know that it was not. I know that it was not on scene, and I know that it was not in his vehicle. But we can circle back to you and get to that.
Is there any evidence at all that he may have been in contact with somebody else before this occurred that may have had any prior knowledge or may have helped him in this event?
Well, needless to say, that is a question that we're intensely focused on, because that would obviously be incredibly meaningful. So far, underline, so far, we have not found any evidence of any accomplices or co-conspirators, foreign or domestic.
And you're using geolocation data to see if his cell phone was near another cell phone, I presume?
Right, we're doing lots of different kinds of cellular analysis, geolocation stuff, looking at his accounts. He, from everything we've seen, which is consistent with what we've learned in interviews, a lot of people describe him as a loner. That does kind of fit with what we're seeing in his devices. His list of contacts, for example, is very short, compared to what you would normally see from most people. So it doesn't appear to be a whole lot of interaction between him, face-to-face or digital with a lot of people.
Okay, thank you.
That doesn't mean there's not any, and that's why we're drilling into. We're trying to talk to anybody who's had any engagement with him whatsoever, digital, in person, classmates, coworkers,
right,
et cetera.
Appreciate that. And now I want to talk about another possible assassination attempt, and I'll start by showing a video of President Biden, and this is from recently. This is in the last month, if we can play that.
Gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America.
Okay, and he's referring to January 6th. Were there gallows erected to hang Mike Pence, as the president says here?
I'm not aware of any physical gallows. I can't remember whether, from a demonstration perspective, there may not have been some kind of replica or symbol of something like that.
That's my impression. Can we show Can you raise that up so you can see it? It looks like there was some kind of prop that was built. The construction doesn't look like it lends itself to actually hanging somebody. It's more of a prop, I think, as you suggested, that was erected on January 6th. But if the president were correct, that these gallows were erected to hang Mike Pence, that would be a very serious allegation, wouldn't it?
I would take it very seriously, yes.
Has anybody been arrested, or do you have any leads in conjunction with the erection of this gallows? We had a picture here on the screen, if you can show it again. It was just up there. There's an individual here who's seen near these gallows. Has he been arrested? Have you identified this person?
You know, I don't know that I could speak to this specific person or the gallows that are pictured on the image. You know, we have had, I think, 850 people who have pled guilty to federal crimes related to January 6th, and I think, you know, another 180, I think it is, convicted at trials. So I can't be sure.
And some of it merely for going into the Capitol, but here the president suggests that individual intended to hang Vice President Pence, which seems like kind of a wild claim myself, given the construction of those gallows. But if we are to take him seriously, or even if we aren't, let me just finish by saying this. If you have no leads, or you're not sure if anybody who erected those gallows was arrested or is being investigated, you know, were there any confidential human sources involved from the FBI or any other agency in the erection of that prop, those gallows?
I'm not aware of anything like that.
All right. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Director Wray. Political violence of any kind is dangerous, unlawful, and totally unacceptable. Just as we all watched and then unequivocally condemned the attempted assassination attempt on our former president, I wish that we could all come together to unequivocally condemn the act of political violence on January 6th, instead of defending props that were used, that were harmful, dangerous props of gallows, attempting to show what people wanted to do to Vice President Pence. Extremists attempted to subvert our democracy in the worst assault on the U.S. Capitol since the War of 1812. Many of us were trapped in the gallery that day. We feared we would not make it out. Insurrectionists were chasing down former Speaker Nancy Pelosi and then Vice President Mike Pence. And I myself have been the direct target of political violence when an armed man with a gun showed up at my door, threatened me and my family, and we actually ended up having to move our home. So I understand the increased tenor of political violence that is racking our country. It has been on the rise, fomented by violent and dehumanizing rhetoric from top public officials, including the former president and members of Congress, sadly, and bolstered by the proliferation of easily accessible guns, including assault-style weapons. All of this violence is unacceptable, and I wholeheartedly condemn it. I just hope we condemn all of the violence, not just one or two incidents. Mr. Wray, today I want to focus on the role of the FBI and the need for the Bureau to remain politically neutral and independent. The FBI cannot and should not be subject to the whims of any president. The majority apparently doesn't think that the FBI needs to be politically neutral and independent. They want an FBI subordinate to the president, not accountable to the American people. That is one part of a larger plan to undermine our democracy, to remove the checks and balances that have protected us, and ultimately to subvert our freedoms. That agenda, promulgated by the former president, his loyalists, and their MAGA allies, is called Project 2025. It is publicly available online. I encourage everyone who's watching this to Google it. It includes plans to undermine every part of our government, including the FBI. Trump's Project 2025 agenda says that the director of the FBI must not be independent of politics, but instead must do whatever the president orders. Under Trump's Project 2025, Trump loyalists would undermine the non-political and independent structure of the FBI. Project 2025 openly calls on the next conservative administration to support, quote, a vast expansion of the number of political appointees in every office across the DOJ, especially the FBI. And so, Mr. Wray, given your extensive experience as a law enforcement professional at DOJ across multiple Republican and Democratic administrations, why do you think it's important that the FBI maintain political independence from the president?
I think the FBI is and needs to stay independent, and that means protecting the American people without fear or favor, upholding the Constitution and the rule of law, and it means following the facts wherever they lead, no matter who likes it. And I add that last part because the essence of independence and objectivity is not that an investigation is going to always yield the result you want. Our independence and objectivity can't only be respected when you like the outcome. That's the very essence of objectivity. Sometimes you're going to like the result, sometimes you're not going to like the result. And that applies to everyone, including us. Any number of times we're disappointed and frustrated by the results of our investigations. But the alternative is an erosion of the rule of law, where the only thing that distinguishes one investigation from another is power. And that's what you see in some of authoritarian countries around the world. So I'm not familiar with this particular
No, I didn't ask you to
Project
comment on that.
2025 thing. I don't
know
know anything about it, but what I can tell you is, from my perspective, the FBI needs to be functioning as independent. Doesn't mean it's not part of the executive branch. It doesn't mean the FBI director doesn't serve at the pleasure of the president, but it does mean that the way we do our work
has to be objective.
Has to be independent.
Yeah, thank you. I have another question about the role of attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel. How do we protect that work?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The role will do the attorneys at the FBI Office of General Counsel play in ensuring that the Bureau respects the constitutional rights of American citizens? How do we protect that work?
So in my experience, the lawyers in the Office of General Counsel play an incredibly important role in ensuring that our agents have their questions about how to comply with the law and conducting their work answered. And ensuring that we conduct our work in the right way, which means scrupulously adhering to the laws and the rules that apply to us.
I just wanted to say before I yield, Mr. Chairman, that the Project 2025 also eliminates the FBI's Office of General Counsel in-house lawyers who are responsible for that role. I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Wisconsin's recognized.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it was when you were here December of last year, Mr. Wray, that you said blinkers were going off in regards to the southern border and what is happening. Has the border situation improved in terms of your assessment with the security of Americans since you were last here in December?
Well, I guess a couple things, and I appreciate the question. So first, the blinking lights comment that I made refers more broadly to the threat environment that I'm seeing as FBI director across a wide range of threats. Contributing to that in a variety of ways are the threats that emanate from the border. So it's not a comment on border issues, it's the threat environment that we face more broadly, in my experience in law enforcement. I am increasingly concerned that foreign terrorists could seek to exploit vulnerabilities at our southwest border or at other ports of entry or in other aspects of our immigration system to facilitate an attack here in the United States. I think that is something we have to be concerned about. And there's been a lot of focus on numbers of this, numbers of that, and I understand that. But as I think was referenced in an earlier question, it doesn't take very many foreign terrorists to be a real problem. We had 19 hijackers responsible for the 9/11 attacks. And we just, not that long ago, had a case, some of the members of the committee will remember, where we charged an individual for trying to smuggle individuals in to assassinate former President Bush.
Are you concerned that the Border Patrol chief, former Border Patrol chief Rodney Scott, said that he was concerned about very, very minuscule data that they were receiving? So there's all this, we are told that illegal aliens are vetted against databases, but oftentimes they're doing biometrics as they come into this country, but not looking behind it in their home countries. Does that concern you? when there's not a review done in the home country?
Well, we certainly need as much help as we can get from the countries of origin of these people. And when I say origin, not just where they come from originally, but countries they've come through. And the biometric enrollment piece is, of course, an important one. We have situations where even if...
Are we doing a thorough enough job of reviewing them, their actions, and their lives in their home countries before they came here?
Well, I mean, we need more help from our foreign partners. There's no question about that. And I think that's an important part of it.
How about our domestic partners, like the CIA and others that are supposed to protect us?
So there's been a lot of course, over the last several years about the pivot to what's called the hard targets, right? The understandable focus, which I support, of focusing on the threat posed by China and Russia and Iran. But that comes, if you look at, for example, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, we start to lose sources of information about foreign terrorist threats from overseas, and that is a concern to me.
Yeah, my time's running out. Has Vice President Harris met with you in regards to the border?
Well, I've been in meetings that have included the Vice President that have in different ways touched on border
issues. Has she
issues.
specifically asked you for a meeting in regards to the threat that is at the border?
You know, I'm not going to get into sort of specific meetings, but I can tell you that I've been in meetings that have included, among other people, the Vice President that touch on border security issues.
Did she ask you questions about what you thought needed to be done in regards to reducing this threat to the American people?
You know, I really can't get into specific conversations.
Is support for President Trump a security concern within the FBI?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear it.
Is support for President Trump a security concern amongst your employees?
No.
Is objection to the COVID-19 vaccine a security threat?
Not from my perspective.
Who improved what is termed the Trump questionnaire within the FBI that was done by SIIS? Dina Perkins, Jeffrey Ventry were behind it. Who was responsible for that? And did you know that there was a Trump questionnaire out there?
So the document you're asking about is an interview outline that we only recently learned about, and in my view is completely inappropriate. I asked my team to get to the bottom of what happened and to ensure that it doesn't happen again, and I've learned that it's not an FBI form, that its use was isolated, that it was created not by an FBI employee, but by an outside contractor, and that individual is no longer affiliated with the FBI. But we are sending what we have found to the Office of Inspector General, and we'll cooperate, of course, with anything they...
Mr. Chairman, I'll just close with this. We keep hearing about these isolated examples, whether it's Richmond Catholics, this instance. When is it, isn't it a pattern? I yield back.
Gentleman goes back, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Director Wray, welcome again to this committee, and I want to thank you and your agents for the good job you're doing to protect Americans. Earlier this week, I was part of the group that went out to visit Butler, Pennsylvania Homeland Security members. I agree with my colleagues that have said violence has no part in our democracy. And I trust you will investigate the events surrounding July 13th thoroughly. I'm going to ask you a question. I hope you'll keep it in mind as your investigation proceeds, which is, who's in charge? Who's in charge at a campaign rally, setting it up? Secret Service campaign. And I ask this question because when I was there, had a couple of law enforcement individuals alluding to that question as well. They gave me an example. They said, if a Secret Service says you need to set up a line of dump trucks behind the stage to serve, to protect the candidate, and the campaign says that's bad optics, who ends up winning the debate? So my question is, who's in charge? And as you investigate this crime scene, hope you ask the locally elected officials. I spoke to a county supervisor, local police and sheriff. They all had information they wanted us to know, to relay. We just didn't have the opportunity to sit down and talk to them. There was a lot of concern that they weren't given enough time to prepare for this rally. They thought there were things that could have been done better. And ultimately, what I keep thinking, what I keep coming back to is question, who's in charge at these rallies? I think it's an important one because we have an election right around the corner. Pennsylvania, Butler, these areas, battleground states around the country will continue to be areas where our candidates, both sides, will show up, and the threats will continue to be there. So I hope, Director Wray, that you'll keep that statement in mind as you continue to investigate this crime scene.
Well, I appreciate the question. I will tell you that we've conducted well over 400 interviews, but we have many more still to conduct. And as is not unusual in an investigation, there will be situations where we have to go back to people we've already interviewed with follow-up questions. And our interviews cover a wide range of people. I do think it's important to make sure that the committee and the American people understand the scope of our investigation versus the scope of others. Our investigation is focused on the shooter and his attack. There is, of course, and I understand completely why, there are two separate reviews, one by the DHS Inspector General and the other by this outside independent panel that's been announced, that are focused on the security posture, the adequacy of the security posture at the rally, Secret Service decision-making and actions and things like that. And so I certainly understand why there are all those questions, but those are in scope of those two other reviews, and of course, whatever Congress chooses to do. Our investigation, though, because of our interviews of people who are on the scene, will relate to that in some ways, and we're going to share whatever we learn that's relevant with those other reviews.
Director Wray, my last minute that I have, I'm going to flip quickly to your good job resources. Earlier this year in the Appropriations Committee, you testified that you were, for 2024, your budget was $500 million below what you needed to sustain your 2023 efforts. A few minutes ago, you talked about foreign terrorists. The last few weeks, I know information has emerged. That information came from FISA information that was able to be collected overseas on these possible terrorist threats. What we have here today is a domestic terrorist, what looks to be a lone wolf. Your statements, there's nothing really there that would have tipped anybody off to this individual. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Well, I don't know that I'd go quite that far because we're still investigating a lot related to the shooter. It does appear so far that we're seeing less in his...
My 6 seconds, I would just say, I would ask that you let us know what resources you need to protect the American public and our candidates in our democratic system.
I appreciate the question. I would just say this. We are consistently today and for quite some time now, we are in an elevated threat environment covering a wide range of threats, and the FBI is central to protecting the American people from those threats. And state and local law enforcement, who depend on us every day, rely on us for all sorts of services, databases, forensic support, training. I could go on and on and on. And a lot of those departments, unlike the FBI, have had a hard time recruiting. And so this is not a time to pull back on our funding because we're going to leave our brothers and sisters in state and local law enforcement twisting in the wind, and then by extension, the American people we're all collectively sworn to protect.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas, recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here. When did you last speak with President Biden?
I don't have the exact date, but it's been certainly since the since the shooting.
So you have spoken to the president since the assassination attempt on President Trump's life?
Yes, sir.
And what was the mental state of the president?
We had a perfectly professional conversation.
And are you, do you have any scheduled briefings of the president upcoming?
Not at the moment specifically scheduled, no.
In 2016 and 2015, top FBI officials infamously texted about, quote, their insurance policy to make sure Trump was never elected or as president. Have any FBI agents texted, emailed, or expressed disappointment that Trump survived the assassination attempt or otherwise editorialized about the assassination attempt?
I don't know about any agent. There have been at least 2 instances, I think, or 1 instance of an individual who posted something that I consider outrageous and totally inappropriate and unacceptable. And that individual has been referred to our inspection division, which is the arm, our sort of internal affairs investigatory arm that, that does the disciplinary process.
Okay. Will you report back to this committee any other incidents?
I'll do my best to share information with the committee.
You testified earlier that the FBI maintains high standards irrespective of so-called diversity efforts. Is it true that in December of 2016, former Director Comey lowered the passing standards for Phase 1, allowing an influx of previously unqualified applicants to continue in the hiring process who normally would have been stopped back in December of 2016?
Yeah, I can't speak to Director Comey's
what were the
changes. I can tell you that at least since I've been director, changes that we have made to...
Well, we're standing on a specific question. Were standards changed? Phase 1, this is a specific part of the process. Were they changed in 2016?
Well, I don't recall if they were changed in 2016. Obviously, I started, as your question presupposes, after that. What I can tell you is, since that time, we have made changes to various phases of the process, but none of them, this is important, none of them lowered the standards. In fact, if anything, they actually increased.
Are you familiar with reporting that we have, and we've asked questions to you about this, I'm not sure the result of the questions, that to more, quote, easily accommodate a large applicants, FBI special agent hiring standards have been relaxed and requirements measurably lowered. This according to a group of former agents who have testified about this and written a report and submitted it to Congress. In addition, specifically, minority, people with 20-year careers, one in particular, a minority who served for more than 20 years, wrote in this report and submitted it to Congress saying that these standards were in fact, and that in fact, if you were hiring, you were moved off of hiring if you put quality above these kinds of DEI requirements. Do you reject this report? And do you have comments on this report?
I haven't read.
You're aware of the report.
I'm aware of the report. I know that I've read every detail of it, but I can tell you that the claim that we have lowered our standards to be less selective and less competitive is not accurate.
So do you believe these former agents are lying to Congress when they submit a report to Congress stipulating and suggesting otherwise? Or are you saying that they are lying?
I'm saying they're mistaken.
Okay, but they're affirmatively on the record. They're telling us and submitting a report to Congress saying that those facts are directly in contradicting what you're testifying here today. So I just want to be clear so we know we're saying that they are submitting evidence to our record to the contrary that you say is untruthful.
I encounter all the time when I travel around the country and have conversations with our agents, and one of the things I try to do is have meetings with some of the longer-serving agents without executive management.
That's okay. My only question is that,
and my point here's
the implication is it's untruthful. So I need to move on. I got 1 minute left. Are you familiar with the case of Paulette Harlow? She's a 75-year-old elderly woman from Massachusetts with a debilitating medical condition. She was prosecuted for violating the FACE Act and sentenced to 2 years in prison. She has to go to Texas in 2 weeks. She was praying at an abortion clinic in Washington, D.C. The FBI interrogated and investigated her. Do you think it is appropriate for a 75-year-old woman who is praying at a clinic in D.C. to be put in prison for 2 years for that activity? Just a simple question. Do you think that's appropriate?
I'm not familiar with the specific case.
You're not familiar with that case. It's been significantly in the headlines, but you don't know how to comment on that case, that it's appropriate for a 75 to be put in prison for 2 years for praying at a clinic.
Again, since I'm not familiar with the case, I don't want to start weighing in because I don't know all the facts. But what I can tell you is that when it comes to FACE Act enforcement and abortion-related violent extremism, I think one of the things that gets lost, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify it, is that really since the Dobbs decision, actually, more of our abortion-related violent extremism investigations have focused on violence against pro-life facilities as opposed to the other way around. And we've had a number of investigations. We're using FACE Act resources and our JTTFs.
We're still waiting on responses on letters that we've sent indicating the data to the contrary, that there's been significant amount of efforts in targeting of people who are pro-lifers who go to clinics, and that they've been, like this case, a 75-year-old woman who is now going to jail in Texas for 2 years because she was praying at a clinic in Washington, D.C. And we've submitted questions on that, and I'd appreciate a response on it. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Director Wray, for being here and for the work that your team does, as well as for sharing the information that you've been able to today. You just got a couple questions about that seem to imply that there was some problem with the FBI's diversity efforts, and certainly the 1950s version of the FBI was singularly Caucasian male agents, et cetera. Is the FBI a better force for having a diverse range of employees and agents?
I think diversity makes us better, but like everything else, it has to be done the right way. Mm-hmm. I think we can have a more diverse workforce and do it without lowering our standards, and that's, in my view, what we've done.
And you haven't lowered standards at the FBI?
We have not. I repeatedly come across people who are confused about different parts of that, and I appreciate the opportunity to set that straight.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all concerned here as we've seen the rollout of this Project 2025 that purports to try to eliminate any reference to diversity efforts across the entire federal government. So it is sort of a top-of-mind concern as it's threatening to become reality. So what I did want to talk about today is something some of my colleagues have mentioned, which is the normalization of threats and violence against public servants at all levels, whether it's election workers or school officials, elected officials and their families, judges, federal law enforcement agents, and others. To be clear, I think it's very clear that the majority of Americans wholeheartedly condemn any sort of political violence and understand that it's not legitimate discourse and that it has no place in our civic life. But words do matter, and they have consequences, particularly when uttered by people in positions of leadership. So that's why I remain very concerned by the willingness of some members of Congress to repeat disinformation and conspiracy theories that undermine trust in our public institutions to serve all Americans. And when elected officials embrace overheated or fact-free rhetoric, it becomes dangerous. I have been heartened, as many national leaders have unequivocally condemned calls to violence, and I would urge all members of this body to do so and continue to do so, regardless of the party affiliation of the perpetrators or the targets of such threats. You and our other national security officials have repeatedly warned us that foreign actors are actively working to spread disinformation, to influence our elections and discredit our public institutions, and we shouldn't be aiding and abetting them. So to live in a country that we aspire to, where our most valued democratic processes like free and fair elections can be carried out unimpeded, and people can run for office, serve their communities, and exercise their right to vote without fear of violence, we've had some concerns about violence around our elections. In 2020, the endorsement and promulgation of falsehoods about the election results by the former president and his campaign led to threats and attacks against election officials and poll workers in Pennsylvania. And those falsehoods also wasted millions of taxpayer dollars on frivolous lawsuits and extraordinary security costs. So as we're again approaching November, we want to ensure that those who implement and defend our elections, our neighbors and our nonpartisan civil servants, can do that important work free from conspiracy theories and threats. So we know our local law enforcement across Pennsylvania are preparing for some disruption and threats because while Pennsylvania may be a battleground state in the upcoming election, that battle should obviously be a war of words over policy and the vision we're charting for our country's future, not an actual civil war. So how is the FBI working with state and local law enforcement to prevent and respond to election-related violence, particularly against election workers?
So in a variety of ways, we're partnering with state and local law enforcement. Obviously, the physical security in the first instance, in most of the respects you're talking about, is in the ordinary course, the responsibility of state and local law enforcement. But we play an important role in a number of ways. So we share, threat bulletins, information like that about things to be on the lookout for, things we're seeing. If we ever have specific threat information, then we work to get it to the right people. We have election crime coordinators, which we've had for decades in all 56 field offices who have existing relationship with not just state and local law enforcement, but election officials, especially focus on security and threat-related issues. And then, of course, we're participating in the Election Threats Task Force that DOJ set up, which is focused on threats of violence or actual violence against election workers specifically. And we've had a number of arrests and even some convictions already on that.
Thank you for your input. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, Director. It's my intention to go approximately another half an hour. Then we will break for the Prime Minister of Israel's address to the Congress on the floor, give you a chance for lunch, and then resume after that. But we'll keep pushing through for the next half hour if we can. Gentlelady from Indiana is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray. I think you have a little bit better tone in conversation, so I appreciate it, and answer some questions, so I appreciate it. Hopefully you'll answer also on 2 letters that I sent you over a year ago, one related to Durham report, and the other one related to Russian-infiltrated SBU that collaborated with FBI. So hopefully we'll get these answers, and hopefully we'll start doing authorization. Don't you think doing authorization would help us to get better answers? Congress should be probably working authorizing new agency. Don't you agree with that?
We work very hard to try to get information to this committee and to other committees.
But authorizing probably would be a good thing for us to do. Don't you agree?
Oh, I'm sorry, authorizing what?
Our spending, not just doing appropriating, but actually doing authorization of spending through this committee.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. We might start doing that. But we can talk about, and a lot of my colleagues on the other side, AR-15 gets a lot of bad rap, like to bring it up, this issue. But really, there are a lot of hunting rifles that probably, maybe even more accurate than a lot of ARs. And don't you agree? We have like millions, right? Don't you agree? We have millions of rifles owned by law-abiding Americans. So do you think we should be taking them? Millions of rifles from law-abiding Americans? What do you think about that? Would that be something feasible, and really we should be doing that?
Well, again, I'm not going to be addressing anybody's specific legislative proposal. From our perspective, from the FBI's perspective, the concern is any dangerous weapon in the wrong hands.
But all weapons
in the
are
hands
dangerous.
of the wrong person.
But all weapons are dangerous, right?
I'm sorry?
All weapons are dangerous. Knives are dangerous,
Sure.
Explosive are dangerous. There are a lot of
weapons are by their very
but are we going to be
definition
confiscating, hunting rifles and rifles for millions of Americans? Do you think it's even feasible to do something like that from law-abiding citizens?
It's not something I'm advocating.
Okay, well, thank you. I appreciate that. So we have to go back. That was a catastrophic failure of security. That's what's happened, recently with attempted assassination. Don't you agree with that?
Well, I think former Director Cheadle has already publicly acknowledged that it was, I think her words were, a significant operational failure.
Then we had, similar situation, a different, talking about bad optics. Speaker Pelosi at that time didn't want to have bad optics for 6, and we didn't have proper security here on January 6th. That was a catastrophic failure too. Are we looking at that? Any one conclusion was made from that? Have we made any adjustments? Because I know a lot of people, got hurt now just being here. There was a lot of cases bringing up the Department of Justice, and a lot of them were really just law-abiding Americans that really just upset with the government, and they have a reason to do it. So I think we need to think about it before we prosecute, or instead of actually, looking how we can deal with real criminals and how we can have a proper security when we have events with so many people there. So did you have confidential human sources? I think you never answered that question on January 6th in the Capitol. Did you have some?
I'm sorry, what's the
confidential human sources. Did you have them on January 6th in the Capitol?
Well, again, I'm never going to be getting into when and where we
Okay,
have or have not used confidential human sources. But
are you willing to stand the record that you had no confidential human sources that went into Capitol on January 6th?
As I've said consistently, I'm not going to get into where we have or have not used confidential human sources. I can tell you that if you are asking if the violence at the Capitol on January 6th was part of some operation orchestrated by FBI sources or agents, the answer is no.
No, I didn't ask you that. I asked you, so did you investigate if any confidential human sources? Did you do any investigation and looking at that? So you're not answering if you had any or not. So if you had potentially, did you do anything you needed to make sure to investigate that none of your sources did anything wrong? If they did wrong, they were prosecuted the same way, like you're trying to prosecute a lot of people that really, even in Supreme Court ruled recently that some unconstitutional charges.
Let me just add that there have now been, I think, 180 individuals who've gone to trial, in addition to the 850 who've pled guilty.
Right, but I think the problem is you put these charges, a lot of people would put guilty. But let me say just quickly, because I only have 10 seconds, really. So I hope you will take seriously what you're doing. You know, related to the border security is also a crisis. You know, your vice president was a lead-in on that. Has she initiated meetings with you to lead, like weekly or monthly meeting where she actually get briefings from you as a lead-in border czar that had that function? Have you had that? Has she initiated any meetings on a regular basis with you?
Again, gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman can respond.
Right. On this issue of confidential human sources, number one, I will say there is a DOJ OIG review that's underway that I think addresses some of these kinds of topics, I believe, but I won't speak for the Inspector General. Second, as to this suggestion, which I've heard all too many times, that somehow January 6th was orchestrated by FBI agents or sources, I will note that in addition to my prior comments, that there have now been 850-ish individuals who've pled guilty, another 180 who've gone to trial. They've all had access to defense counsel, discovery, all the things the Constitution and the rules provide them. It's been in front of something like 15 different judges, I think dozens of juries, and not one has given credence to this notion. And in fact, I don't think any of them have even really seriously tried to raise it. So it's not just my word for it. Look what's happening in the cases. Thank you.
The gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Director Wray, for being here, for your testimony today, for the work that you do each and every day, and that your frontline agents across the country do each and every day to protect Americans, to keep our country safe. Also grateful for the work that you're doing in investigating the horrific events of July 13th and the attempted assassination of former President Trump, which everyone must and has condemned. I would first just ask, do you believe that the FBI has the adequate resources to ultimately ensure that your agency gets to the bottom of it and fully investigates this terrible crime?
Well, we are devoting massive amounts of resources to this specific investigation. We have easily several hundred FBI agents, analysts, and professional staff working on it. It involves over half of the FBI's 56 field offices, almost every headquarters division. We even have some of our overseas offices working on it. You might say, well, why is that? Well, because some of the companies that involve accounts or purchases or communications or what have you that the shooter used are foreign companies, so we have to get evidence from overseas from those companies. I've talked about our lab a little bit earlier today. We've got our Office of Technology Division working on the digital devices. We have our Behavioral Analysis Unit, our BAU, working on helping us build out a profile of the shooter. I could go on and on and on. So it's all on deck on this case as I think is appropriate. Now, when you ask about our resources, I've been public about the fact that the fiscal year 20 budget put us $500 million below where we needed to be to sustain current operations. And on FY25, the current House mark would put us significantly further back behind that and would result in significant risks across every program and our support to state and local law enforcement. We arrested something like 50 violent criminals per day, every day, last year. The current mark would mean more violent criminals on the street, more neighborhoods at risk. We have about a 1,300% increase in our investigations related to China and its targeting of us. And I can assure you, China's not cutting its budget. This would mean more threats from China. We have something like 300 to 400 investigations just into cartel leadership. And about hardly a week goes by when some FBI field office isn't seizing enough fentanyl to wipe out an entire state. those cuts means more fentanyl on the street, more people dying. So the people who suffer the most are state and local law enforcement and the American people we're sworn to protect. And so
And let me
look
just
forward to
say,
working with Congress, but we really need to be smart about what we're doing, and I think that would be a step in the wrong direction given the threat environment that we face.
And I couldn't agree with you more, Director Wray, and of course we've talked about this during previous hearings in which you've testified, and to be clear, that I think the budget that House Republicans have proposed, which is about a $325 million cut to the FBI, would do precisely what you've described and have deleterious impacts for public safety across our country, and House Democrats are certainly working to prevent those cuts from taking place. You've talked at great length about the events of July 13. There's justifiably a lot of public interest in the investigation, which we understand is ongoing. Wonder if you might, if there's anything that you'd like to disclose or provide to the committee or to the public that perhaps has not yet been gleaned during the course of this hearing, and just give you an opportunity, because there's a lot of folks related to the investigation. Yeah.
One thing I can give an update on, which is pretty fresh here. We had some conversations with some of the members about the access to the roof and the ladder and so forth. And our evidence response teams and their forensic collection, we've now believed that the subject climbed onto the roof using some mechanical equipment on the ground and vertical piping on the side of the AGR building. In other words, we do not believe he used a ladder to get up there.
One question, if the chairman might indulge me with just a few extra seconds. There's an article recently regarding several former Trump administration national security officials who had received a duty to warn briefing from the FBI regarding the potential threat from Iran. And I think there is this article made clear deep concern that these individuals have, justifiably so, about the threat level, and particularly given the events of the last several months, and the need for there to be an increased security posture and security personnel for former officials who may very well still be at risk. And I don't know if you're familiar with that article. I'm trying not to use names here, but I think would perhaps follow up with your agency and with the Department of Justice more broadly to ensure that any individuals who are potentially facing a threat from Iran or another hostile actor in a foreign nation have the resources they need to have the security available to them.
So again, without reference to any specific individual, I want to be very clear about this because I've tried to be vocal on this, but it sometimes doesn't get noticed as much, which is that in my view, the Iranian government has been extremely aggressive and brazen. We have seen in the last few years an attempt, I'm speaking just from public information now, an attempt to assassinate a former U.S. National Security Advisor on U.S. soil. We have seen an attempt first to kidnap and then to try to murder an American dissident/journalist who was a critic of the Iranian regime, right smack in the middle of New York City. We have seen a cyber attack against a children's hospital in New England that ties back to Iran. We have seen, as I've testified before, as Director Ratcliffe and I announced, an effort by the Iranians to target the 2020 presidential election. And that's all before you even get to the fact that the Iranian government is the leading state sponsor of terrorism. So if that's not enough to convince people that Iran is a threat, I don't know what is.
But Director, was there a distinction between what the gentleman from Colorado raised and what you just said, this general concern in these specific incidents you talk about, and a direct specific threat on President Trump that's distinct from what you've been describing as this general concern with Iran?
Well, again, I can't get into specific pieces of class.
And if so, when? If it was a distinct threat on President Trump, when did that take place?
Yeah, all I can tell you, certainly in this kind of setting, is of U.S. officials for the Soleimani strike is something that is a reality that the Iranian government has at times called for very publicly. And whenever there is reporting, let me try to answer your question this way. Whenever there is reporting about any of those protectees, We share the information in a variety of ways, working with the intelligence community, working with whoever is the protective service with responsibility for that individual, and we do it in a timely way using the duty to warn process that was just referred to. And to my knowledge, everything along those lines that's relevant was shared in a timely way with the relevant people.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
Director Wray, thanks for being here. Where were you when you heard that President Trump was shot, and then what were like your immediate actions, response to that as director?
I was about to have dinner with family, and I was horrified and angry.
I'm just thinking, the reason I asked the question is because I'm still trying to figure out kind of the lanes, what the FBI would respond to and what the Secret Service has the responsibility to respond to. Can you just kind of cover that again?
Sure. So the FBI is not responsible for, has never really been part of our mandate or mission for the physical security of venues, of specific protectees or anything like that. That's, if it's somebody within Secret Service's scope, that's their mandate and mission. We are a law enforcement and intelligence agency, and so if you think about it this way, we're the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We're not the Federal Bureau of Security. You might say, well, what's the difference? Well, there is a difference. We investigate crimes. We investigate threats to national security, but we don't, questions about security posture, the adequacy of resources and assets that were deployed to protect a specific individual, whether there's enough security, and certainly the staffing of that security is not something the FBI, again, we're 116 years old, has historically done.
So at this point, have you been able to go through the shooter's home and kind of document kind of what you found as far as evidence goes?
So we have been able to search the shooter's home. So again, just sort of tying your first question to your second question now, our role is to conduct an investigation of the shooter and the attack. And so we're going to conduct a painstaking, intense investigation of that. We have, among other scenes that we've processed using evidence response teams, in addition to the rally scene itself, of course, we have been through the shooter's home, his bedroom, other parts of the house, et cetera.
Have you been able to establish that he did go to a range and either zero that weapon in or, at least target shoot that weapon prior to the assassination attempt?
So we do assess that he went to a